Next up, while many voters will be casting their ballots in person, as usual, tomorrow for the state primary election, Secretary of State William Galvin says more than 800,000 people have already turned in their ballots, mostly by mail, accounting for more than 3/4 of the total expected turnout. And given that it's a process local and state election officials have never dealt with before, there are concerns it could lead to delays in the final results in some big contests, like the contentious U.S. Senate battle between Ed Markey and Joe Kennedy, the fight for the 4th District House seat that Kennedy is leaving behind, and the neck-and-neck race between 16-term Congressman Richard Neal and Holyoke Mayor Alex Morse. So what will election night look like this year? Stephanie Murray, author of the essential Politico Massachusetts Playbook, joins me now. Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, Adam. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for making time to be here. I know you are insanely busy these days. Let me ask you, I was trying to put together a wrap-up piece heading into the primary for GBH News, and the conclusion that I came away with was it's been decades, if ever, since Massachusetts saw this tumultuous primary. Now, I know when you get to my age, you start to be overly dramatic about years gone by and say things were never like, they are today or whatever. Am I being overly dramatic here, or is this really a deeply unusual primary election for the state?
Adam, I'm going to have to indulge you here. It is really unusual.
Thank you.
To have so many competitive primaries is something that even 5 or 6 years ago would have been totally unheard of. This trend of challenging an incumbent lawmaker coming in as an insurgent, somebody who's younger, and challenging an incumbent began around in 2014, this modern trend at least, with Seth Moulton, who unseated Congressman John Tierney. Perhaps the most famous and best known example of this was Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who ousted former Rep. Mike Capuano in 2018. And from there, I think you really saw a trickle-down effect or a ripple effect. And we've got primaries all over the place. Congressman Richard Neal's facing a primary. Congressman Steve Lynch. Seth Moulton, who I mentioned, finds himself in the incumbent position. And of course, Senator Ed Markey is facing a tough primary challenge from Congressman Joe Kennedy.
So as you size up the cases that the primary challengers are making against the incumbents, it's hard to find a through line, it seems to me, about what arguments they're making. Back when you mentioned Seth Moulton, back when he ran against John Tierney's wife had some serious legal problems. Ayanna Pressley was able to say, in effect, it's great that Mike Capuano is good on the issues, but representation matters, and, paraphrasing here, I'd be an African-American woman in the congressional delegation. We need that. But it's not that simple for the races that we're looking at this time around, right?
I think the through line that you need to look at here is what the progressive left is going to do. In race after race in 2018 and in 2020 across the country, we've seen progressive groups kind of rally together to help progressive challengers, usually younger, to the left of an incumbent Democrat, beat them. And you've seen that in New York with Jamal Bowman and Elliot Engel, in Missouri with Cori Bush. But what's happening here in Massachusetts that's fascinating is this race between Congressman Neal and Mayor Alex Morse, which is kind of that, it fits that model. But in the Senate race, I'm looking to see whether the progressive left has been able to put together kind of a playbook on how to protect an incumbent instead of knocking one out.
You've reported on that race a ton. Is it unfair to generalize and say it's about Markey the progressive versus Kennedy the moderate? Erin O'Brien, who we both know, political science professor at UMass Boston, told me the other day she thought that those were roles that voters have assigned to the candidates that don't necessarily equate with the candidates' actual political identities. Or is that, in fact, a fair framing for it?
I'd have to agree with that it's a tricky framing, and I don't think it tells the whole story. Certainly, Markey is the candidate who progressive groups have rallied around, the Sunrise Movement. For example, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been one of his most important endorsers. But Joe Kennedy would say, there are points on Markey's record that are less progressive and kind of more in line with the moderate Democrat, like Joe Biden, the vote for the 1994 crime bill, the Iraq war, things like that. So even though Markey and Kennedy kind of agree when you talk to them that there isn't a whole lot of daylight between their policy positions. But as far as what the voters are saying and kind of where the groups are rallied around, Markey is definitely kind of, he's drummed up that progressive base.
We should also mention, because I'm sure people watching the Senate race would want us to note this, at least Kennedy supporters, he's made a big point of the argument that Markey is not suitably attentive to issues of race and racial justice. I know Markey doesn't agree with that assessment, but that's another case that Kennedy's been making, which you usually think of the progressive candidate in a given race as making.
Yeah, it's just another example of how kind of tricky this race is to define. But Congressman Kennedy has made Markey's record on racial justice an issue in the race. And it's one of the few places, I mean, it's not really a policy difference, but it goes in Kennedy's line of argument and his reason for running that Markey isn't in Massachusetts enough. But, you know, Markey's been kind of granted I'm not sure what the right word for it is, but since we've all been stuck at home because of the coronavirus, he's been home in Malden a lot. So he's been able to blunt that criticism that he's not here enough by campaigning over live stream and in videos in front of his house.
What is your take on how the Markey campaign was able to make him the favorite candidate of so many young voters in particular? When I watch chatter about this race on Twitter, I'm amazed at how many people who are college age or even younger are so deeply invested in Markey, who obviously has a few decades on Joe Kennedy. How does that happen?
There are a few reasons for this. One of them is that Markey took his biggest weakness, which is why he had a few other primary challengers earlier in the race, and that was that voters didn't really know who he was. His name ID and his favorability were relatively low last summer, not because people didn't like him, just because he was kind of existing in the shadow of better-known Democrats like Elizabeth Warren, John Kerry, the list goes on. So he took that and he was able to kind of redefine himself to voters. So last summer, he, according to a Massing poll, 70% of voters under the age of 30 didn't know who he was or didn't have an opinion of him. Fast forward to this August, and Markey's leading that same age group with 70% of support. So he was able to take that unknownness and define himself the way that he wanted voters to see him. And central to that was Ocasio-Cortez, his most important endorsement.
And he did stuff and I don't want to get into talking about what the kids like these days because I don't have a clue, but he did stuff like showing up in his super old school Nike high tops outside his home in Malden and just figuring out ways to flick in little bits of texture that, again, this younger cohort of voters really seemed to enjoy.
Yeah, that's right, Adam. And he was able to, you know, not only were kids making memes and videos and stuff for him on Twitter, but he would bring them into his campaign and hire them as digital fellows to continue that sort of thing. So he did really well. He kind of won the social media fight. You know, we say Twitter isn't real life, but he was able to kind of parlay that into a really big, powerful, small dollar fundraising base. And over the course of the summer, he's actually been able to raise more money than Congressman Kennedy did. And, you know, you'll remember the end of last year, beginning of this year, the story every quarter was Kennedy outraises Markey. Now that's flipped.
Briefly, before we wrap up, how long are we going to have to wait for decisive results in these races? You had a piece you wrote the other day for the newsletter saying essentially this thing could drag on. How long are you expecting it to drag on?
That is the big question. It depends on how many mail-in ballots come in on Tuesday. We know that the Postal Service has slowed down. There are all these questions. We know tons of folks have already voted. So it depends how quickly cities and towns can count those ballots. But if any of the races are close, it wouldn't be unheard of for one of the campaigns, whether it's the Senate campaign, that crowded race to replace Kennedy in the House in his old district, to sue the state to get ballots that were postmarked by September 1st but came in later. Someone could sue again for that to count, which would
I do not even want to think about that.
That would put things back.
It's good of you to warn me and everyone else. Stephanie Murray, thank you for talking with us. Again, polls will be open the usual hours tomorrow, 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., although your polling place may have changed. To check, head to Where Do I Vote? trackmyballotma.com. If you voted by mail, you can check the status of your ballot at trackmyballotma.com. And if for any reason your local election officials have not received your ballot by tomorrow, you'll still be able to get a new ballot and vote in person at your polling place. Do join us for our election night special tomorrow night from 8 to 9 p.m. on 89.7 Radio, Facebook Live, and Zoom.